So let's continue our study of the cutoff versus button 2-bet pots by looking at the 4-span high boards. So in this tutorial, we're just going to go and have a look at an overview of the flop strategy and maybe some turn overviews, just so we can get a better idea about how these sort of rag boards play out. So 4-span boards, that usually means that there is a single open-ended straight draw possible, and then there's two other gut shots. So here, for example, 6-3, the open ender is the 5-4, and then there's gut shots with 7-5 and 4-2, that sort of stuff, right? So there's a handful of gut shots alongside one open-ended straight draw. So button versus cutoff, single raise pot. Let's have a closer look at the flop strategy for both players. Player 1 here is the cutoff, and we can see that on the high boards, you've got a overall checking frequency of 62.49%, equity of 48.87%. So these ace high and king high type boards are slightly better for the cutoff than the previous set of boards that we looked at. Organizing things by the checking frequency, you can see that these double Broadway type boards with like a king queen, a king 10, a king jack do fairly well for the cutoff in terms of both equity and checking frequency. And so this means that the cutoff's preflop range, which is very king high, queen high, jack high, and that kind of stuff, heavy with the offsuit broadways and these suited high-low type hands, will hit a board like king queen X, king jack X, king 10X reasonably well compared to the in-position players range that doesn't have as many of those offsuit broadway type hands, really only having king queen, ace jack, ace queen. Looking here, and then the suited broadways doesn't hit those kinds of flops quite as strong. On the other hand, these ace kind of medium low, ace low low boards and king low low boards are doing better for the button, right? The reason why that's the case is, sure, there's the one high card with the top pair. So here, for example, when ace 9-6, there's the ace, but there isn't a second one of those, and that second card is replaced by a lower card which hits the cutoff's pocket pair calling range preflop more strongly, in terms of, if you got ace 9-6, the button's going to have pocket 9s and pocket 6s. So they've made a set on the pocket 9s, they made a set with pocket 6s, and in contrast, the cutoff doesn't really have as many pairs on the 9 or the 6, as many one pair hands. Other stuff that we can say about that, on stuff like a6-3, king 8-5, the button's going to have some of these pocket pairs, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, which isn't overpaired to that second card. And so having an overpair to that second card means you can get some value from second pair on certain runouts and certain lines. So that's something for the cutoff to watch out for in the button's range. Overall, his checking frequency is 62%, and then the bet size that the cutoff is going to be used is pretty small on a lot of these boards. Going for this quarter pot bet, it's half pot bet. There's not too much big betting in terms of the pot size bet and the 1.5, and there's almost no 2x pot. If there was a 3/4 pot, maybe that would be used sometimes. If there was a 1/3 pot, maybe that would be used sometimes. But this is the sim that was constructed. Now let's have a look at the in position bet sizes after the cutoff checks. So looking at this, overall check back frequency for the button 57.52, which makes sense. Usually in position player is going to be betting into the out of position player at a higher frequency than if they check, just on average, not necessarily for each specific board. And then the bet size is used by the button slightly larger, got the combination of this Quarter pot being used at 22% of the time, but you've got this big betting happening with a 1.5 time pot bet and a pot size bet at a reasonable frequency, but not so much for this half pot bet. And so what's really happening is you've got certain boards which likes to split between a big bet size and a small bet size. That's freaking out in the background. Once we found a bug or something. Anyway, so this sort of bigger bet size where you got like 1.5 times a pot, or just a pot size bet, and then like the smaller bet size with the rest of the range, kind of deny equity from the vast amount of air in the cutoffs range. So let's have a look at one example of this idea. So maybe King 10-3. King 10-3, let's have a look at the equities on the flop. King 10-3, for cutoff, they got 49.66% equity. Fair amount of top pair compared to the button. So here you've got 15.5% top pair from the cutoff, and then the button's only got 9.79% top pair. But the button's got more sets, and these top pairs on average are stronger, right? They got the stronger offsuit broadways, right? Talking king, queen, king, jack, king 10, king 9. And then those top pairs being stronger just simply outkick these weaker top pairs, these sort of weaker suited top pairs. Of course, that's not necessarily too bad, because here the cutoff's got this king 10 offsuit which opens preflop, which the button doesn't call. Okay. Two bet sizes for the cutoff here. You've got quarter pot, half pot. Quarter pot being raised a small amount. This is 18%, actually a fairly large amount. So you got to make sure that you raise these small kind of block flop sizes to a nice chunky raise size here, 75%, and a pot size raise, and the 75%. So this half pot bet being raised at 70 to 75% raise size, 11% of the time. Checking, and you've got these two sizes, right? This pot size bet and this quarter pot size bet, and we'll look at the ranges between the two. So this pot size bet is much more set heavy, right? You got the set of threes being put in there at a pretty high frequency, and the king 10 as well, and just like the stronger top pairs like this king queen is being bet more often for this bigger size, compared to the quarter pot size, which is less set heavy and more like these pocket pair heavy, right? These lower pocket pairs are really betting to deny equity from a 2 overcard type hand in the cutoffs range. So looking at this quarter pot bet, a lot of those 2 overcard type hands like this ace high and some of these weaker draws will fold, or if the cutoff has something like a gut shot or an open ender with the queen jack 9, queen 9 type stuff, they will have to pay that quarter pot to see the turn, rather than just having that being checked back and seeing it for free. And of course, in this smaller size, there's a little bit more of this 10x as well compared to the big size, which has much less 10x. All right. Let's have a look at a different type of board where there's going to be some overbetting when checked too. Pick the right one, yeah. So here, a6-3, right? Like you would just from like initial inspection, like you kind of feel that on ace high type boards that the preflop raiser has a range advantage, but when you're getting flat from the field or even from the small blind, that's not necessarily the case. So here, for example, like the cutoff on this a6-3 it's got really poor equity, down at 44.83%. And this is because the button's flatting a lot of strong ace-x preflop, and the pocket pairs have just hit these two ranks, the 6 and the 3. And in contrast, the cutoff has just got loads of just really weak unpaired hands, compared to the button, which doesn't really have too many of these unpaired hands preflop. And if they do have those unpaired hands, it's usually suited. So that means that, you know, with the sort of broadways, you can make a backdoor straight or a backdoor flush draw with this ace of spades or the diamond and the club flush run out. So checking, and you've got the two sizes, the 1.5 time pot bet. This 1.5 time pot bet, very, very set heavy, set of sixes, set of threes. And then some of these stronger top pairs, turning these pocket pairs down the bottom here into bluffs. And then this quarter pot size, less set heavy, but more of these weaker top pairs are being thrown into there, and the pocket pairs that are stronger than the six, betting at a decent frequency to just deny equity from 2 overcards and also get called by a 6, right? So betting small there, betting this quarter pot size when check do, really forcing this hands like king queen, king jack, queen 10, right? These sort of Broadway type hands, these offsuit Broadway type hands to really think about whether they want to continue. And even some of these sort of Broadways like 10-9 suited, which is back to straight draw, back to flush draw with the 6 and the mainly with the 6. A lot of those hands have difficulty continuing against this small bet, and so like the buttons pocket pairs here, namely pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s, benefit from betting small to deny that equity. So those are the two sizes, the small bet and the big bet. Another thing that can be said after it goes small bet and then call, I mean, there's a fair amount of raising here on ace kings being put into the checking range on the flop to go for this check raise. And if it just calls, it goes for a check raise on the turn all the time. But after it goes bet call, I'll put the turn report. And in terms of the donking lines, not a lot of donking lines. Obviously donking on a 6, an ace, and somewhat a 3, but mainly a 6 because there's a lot of 6x in the cutoffs range, which can call this flop bet. But after there's the check, what have we got here? We've got mainly the 2x pot size being used. You can notice for the button here, this 2x pot size being used at 22.53% of the time, and the pot size bet being used at 11.56% of the time, and then checking back, and almost never betting small, right? So here the button after the small bet on the flop is utilizing the fact that they can check back the turn and see a river and kind of outdraw the opponent, and simultaneously adding polarity in a big betting range, so and betting like twice the pot or the pot size bet. Yeah, this is this 4x pot bet, which is pretty cheeky. We can have a look at that if you want. And there's the donking getting raised pretty big, check, and then 4x pot bet, and then the range that's just betting 4 times a pot is basically saying I've got a boat. Right, I'm referencing a boat or yeah, that's how polar this is. There's not much like just random trips, random ace queen, because you don't even get called by worse is bet 4 times a pot and call brick and then just rip that boat into your opponent. With some bluffs. And ace queen's getting called by worse there. Anyway, that's a bit of an interesting line. Don't really expect you guys to know too much about that, but you guys can look up these sims yourself and then study these sort of very interesting lines. Yeah, so overall against that small bet on the flop, after there's a call, because these 4-span boards are somewhat dry, even though there's a straight draw, there's still going to be a lot of big betting on the turn after it goes bet call. So bet call, check, and then here once the straight completes, there's still a fair amount of betting, right? Because when those straights complete, the button's made some sets and has some flush draws. So we can have a look at that. Say for example 4 of diamonds, check, betting a pot size bet, betting twice the pot, and the range which does it is a little bit different. All the top pairs checking back the turn and then bluff catching the river, or betting the river if your opponent checks another time. But all these big bets here doesn't really matter too much that the straight has completed, because it's just a gut shot straight that's completed, and they're only going to have that fairly rarely with the full combos that opens before the flop. So not too much to worry about. On the other hand, a 7, There's a little bit more straights now because it's pretty easy to have the 5-4 offsuit, sorry, 5-4 suited for the cutoff. But the frequency at which they have it is going to be the same because a lot of 5-4s raise the flop. So just the fact that the straight's completed on the turn doesn't really mean too much because a lot of those straight draws should have raised the flop to begin with, especially the stronger straight draws. So that they don't end up having too many straight draws going into the turn on these lower span type boards. Later on, we can look at the higher span type boards with a lot more straight draws, and we can see how that works out. So that's the straight draws at the bottom. The straight draws at the top are a little bit different because there's more of them. There's just far more of them. King Jack 5, for example, we can have a look at that. This also got a flush draw as well. We can have a look at quickly at some of the turn play after it goes check and then bet. Bet size here being a pot size bet rather than betting small. But say for example after this pot size bet, you've got the play on the turn. Fair amount of donking after a pot size bet. So you got to remember that you've got to remember to donk after your opponent's bet big into you on certain turns, right? Because the range that bets big into you on the flop is fairly polar, and so they're just going to miss certain ranks. And so on the ranks that work really well for you, so here are 5, a jack, and a king, like you do want to develop a substantial donking range. Like here, donking at overall frequency of 17%, which is a lot, right? You can donk small and then prevent your opponent essentially from checking back the bluffs that were on the flop. Checking back the turn, I mean. So all those flop bluffs, which bet this size, these kind of ace highs, like these flush draw type hands, even these pocket pairs that make this pot size bet. And then like the turn is one of those turns which just donks at pretty high frequency. Say for example this 8 of hearts. Those weaker hands check back to basically see the river, and so they end up getting that getting the 2 cards for the price of 1 if you don't have a donking range on the turn. It's important to read which turn cards it makes sense to have a donking range, right? The ones which substantially improve your equity basically just missed a lot of the opponent's potential bluff candidates. Those ones will work pretty well. So here the 8. Why is the 8 of hearts a brick? Because if you look at the way that the button on the flop is constructed, their bluffing range, when an 8 comes in, like that set doesn't really get hit. But on these lower cards, because the button's turning these lower pocket pairs into bluffs on the flop, they'll end up making sets on those ranks down the bottom. So it's not quite as good to be donking into them when they've made an additional set with their flop betting range. Anyway, so flop bet, call. Look at the turns. The turns that aren't really being donked at a super high frequency, which you might think that they would be, are these Broadway type ones, like these straight completers. We can have a look at that. Right, I mean, sure, this completes a straight, but what straight does it complete? This completes this ace 10. The queen completes the ace 10, the 10-9, all of this ace 10, 10-9 against a flop size, against a pot size bet on the flop, has difficulty continuing, which is the open ender. This is queen 10, yeah, completes on a 9, doesn't it? Completes on an ace. For example, we look at it completing on a 9, and like some of that queen 10 is raised on the flop against a pot size bet. But the fact that the opponent is going to have a fair amount of queen 10 that makes this pot size bet on the flop, just because it's the only open ender, and so they're going to be betting at a fairly high frequency because it needs to be in that betting range. Otherwise, on the 9, there's going to be a pretty big asymmetry in the number of straights that there's going to be. So pot size bet, call. Straight about 6% there and 7% there, so it's not a huge difference. The main thing is that there's still a lot of sets for the imposition player, and so the imposition player is going to keep betting. So just the fact that there's this pot size bet and then a call doesn't really mean that there's sufficient, sufficiently many straights for either player. And all of the queen 10 for the cutoff in the first place has bet the flop rather than going for that check call. So that just means that there's less queen 10 in this check call range on the flop. So it's important to understand how you're constructing your flop checking range as well as your flop betting range and trying to balance it so that you don't end up being too straight heavy in the flop check call range when those straights hit on the turn. Right, you can use those straight draws as bluffs on the flop instead. Now, quarter pot bet, raise at a high frequency. We can look at this quarter pot bet and sort of how it continues going on to the turn for the out position player. So against quarter pot bet and a call, right, there's not quite as much overbetting as if it was in position, because in position, they had this ability to check back the turn. But for the out of position player, after you go quarter pot bet call, because you don't really get that ability to check back, there's a lot more blocking with these smaller sizes, especially this quarter pot size. So there's a lot more blocking, but there is still a little bit of big betting on certain turns. The out of position player, on the other hand, when they've got a strong hand, instead of like having to make that overbet on the turn after they bet small on the flop, what they can do instead is sometimes go for a check raise instead of making that big bet, or they can block 3-bet if they want to. So here, for example, yeah, I mean, we can look at it. Let's have a look at the 2. So 2, right? Block size here, and then after you get raised, you got the 3-bet with these set of jacks there. Right, so that set of jacks is playing the same way as the Jack X would. Checking and facing a bet, and then making a raise, or just calling and then jamming the river. Of course, there's a lot of sizes here. You got quarter pot, half pot, pot, and 2 pot. They're all being used, and each one is being used with a slightly different range, with slightly different polarity. Well, I mean, significant different polarity between 2x and quarter pot, but as you go along, you can kind of see how the polarity shifts and the bluff to value ratio shifts. So here, the quarter pot bet, you can see that there's this component on the left here where it's fairly green. You can consider that to be your bluffs, sorry, your value, and then your bluffs is on the right where it's a little bit red. So you can see what the bluff to value ratio here is. So maybe there's about 1/3 bluffs and then 2/3 value. So it's about 2 to 1 for this small size here on the turn. And that small size really is betting small to avoid having to check and then having the opponent bet into them. Betting small so to deny a bit of equity from the imposition's call range in terms of if the out of position player here was to check, if cutoff was to check, then the button would check back. So you get a little bit of equity denial and a little bit of blocking effect as well. So it's a little bit of both. You get some nice thin value out of position here because you don't actually have to get called by worse as often when you're out of position compared to when you're in position. Half pot bet, right? More polar, much more top pair, heavy, and then the twice pot bet, more 2 pairs, and the stronger top pairs, and then you go up to the pot size bet, and then you go up to the twice pot bet, a lot more trips, 2 pairs, aces, and then the strongest top pairs, king, queen, ace, king. Right, you can see that in the overview. Ace, king, king, queen, betting fairly big. King, jack, betting fairly big. There's a king, jack as a 2 pair. And then the other stuff, you got a really nice bluff to value ratio there. So lots of different sizes that you can choose, lots of different lines that you can take and study. Hopefully that gives you guys a bit of an overview about how these higher rag boards are being played. Especially the ones without too many straight draws on the flop. So it's still reasonably dry, rag board. All right, thanks. I'll see you guys in the next one where we'll look a little bit more about the 4-span highs and focus a bit more on the different runouts. See ya.